Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal News Hour. Thank you so much for coming. Ah, Today has been a crazy day. I'm kind of crashing in to the news hour a little bit. It's just I woke up to a million different emails and a million different subjects about a million different things, and the day kind of went downhill from there. Um, on top of just life admin, I had to dash out to run some errands today, and it was just, yeah, it's a lot because it's a lot. Um, and it's not over, not by far. And it's just a busy Monday, busy at work, busy in my personal life, just busy. It's start of a new week. Um, and it's even more fun because my birthday is on Saturday, so that's always fun. Probably going to Outback for dinner. One of my other friends sent me a gift card, which is really cool. Um, and I'm definitely going to enjoy that. I do enjoy a good bloomin' onion. So, um, yeah. It's a crazy start to the week. This, I will warn you right now, this live stream is going to be a bit long, and I'll tell you why. I have open right now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, which includes a video, 12, 13, 14, 15 tabs. There's so much to talk about this week, both in just like vibes and cultural trends and things that I really want to talk about that have really touched me this week. And then also in some of the big stories of the week, which are tariffs, immigration, maybe some cracks in Trump land, um, and some of the latest legal goings on of the Trump administration. So normally I kind of talk about some stuff beforehand, but I kind of want to just dive in. Except I'm going to talk about this for a minute because I was reading a thread um, about this thing called this trend in hobby spaces and casual things that people do. Um, and it was talking about how recreational and entertainment um, are there's less people doing them, and one of the trends that sort of bubbled up in all of that was the kind of lack of people casually doing it. And that this if you're gonna do something, you really get into it, you really focus on that thing, and um, and then that's kind of it. Whereas in times previous, people would sort of casually play golf but never be very good at it. They would casually do this but never be very good at it. They would casually do that but never be very good at it. Whereas now people really kind of lock in. It becomes their thing. It becomes part of their identity. All this sort of thing, and they get really sort of into these very narrow, very niche ecosystems. There were so many different causes tossed around for this. But I found it fascinating because I had written an article several years ago called "Where There Was Where Once We've Heard Monoculture, We Now Have No Culture," and I was complaining about the fact that good cultural things are things that people can participate in with very little cost or using any things that they have. Anyone can sort of start doing it, like dancing in the town square or joining a parade or whatever have you. Um, and and that that nowadays we just don't necessarily have that, but also we don't have the sort of universal cultural touchstones that we all get into. We don't have the common TV shows, the common movies, the common music. Everything is a niche and a subculture. Everything, and it makes it hard to talk to people because if you haven't seen certain shows or movies or consume certain media or whatever have you, you can't even talk about those things. So, and the whole, lack of the water cooler gossip thing has been talked about before. And there's a conversation to be had about atomization, how, divided that we are. But I think the big one is in any sort of kind of hobby or niche community or whatever have you, there's now so much info online. So there's kind of this this judgment that occurs, like, well, why have you need to go online and watch some YouTube videos and blah 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 and all this type of thing. And and that's kind of, I think the bar has been raised for what's considered entry level. And I think it speaks to an economic system that prizes specialization over universality. Um, I think it also speaks to an age in which many people monetize hobbies as a side hustle to make money, start businesses, be the next career move, be a fallback, whatever have you. Which incidentally in the 19th century was pretty common. If a woman was having financial trouble, she would take in take in the neighbor's laundry, take in other people's laundry, take in their ironing, start cleaning houses, you know. Michael Caine always told a joke about his mom and her friends used to clean houses for extra cash, and when he got real famous, he had to, he set her up with some money and said, okay, no more cleaning houses, because every time you do, the newspapers write that I'm neglecting you. But, she was just, it was an extra way to bring in a few extra quid, which is nice to have for a rainy day, all this sort of thing. And, and that, I think it's kind of, in a weird way, I feel like it's kind of a bit of a return. But I also feel like it's a bit of the death of the casual leisure culture of the 20th century. There's just so many different factors at play that people put multiple threads in there. It was very interesting. But that's kind of what I was reading this right before I was getting ready to set up for the show. And I thought it would be kind of interesting to mention. And I'm not going to go any further with that because we have a ton of news today. So let's dive right into the stories. Let me do this and let me click that. There we go. So this is less of a news story and more of a attitude about things that could be very important moving forward. And there was this viral tweet. Let's start with this tweet because this has been going around. I have many great friends that now refuse to visit me in the U.S. I also know people working at US AGI labs that are scared of traveling around in case they get nabbed on a technicality, have their visa taken, and lose their job. I'm glad I'm a citizen, but I consider it over, to be honest. And it stems from this viral post on Reddit of this people from New Zealand who were backpacking and got deported from the U.S. for saying that they were backpacking, and just what's happening in terms of tourism and, immigration really putting off people from traveling in the U.S. I have a story about how that's affecting tourism dollars. We'll get there. And so this contribution I thought was uniquely interesting. And it starts at Dying Empire. I get the vibe that many of my more MAGA-leaning peers would actually like to see the U.S. become more like Europe, the dying continent they spend so much time ridiculing. They see no problem with an economically stagnant, culturally weak, isolationist dead empire. The right somehow evolved from illegal immigration is bad, yep, totally on board with that, to keep everyone out, even the nice young white people. I want my country to be like Leningrad in 1942. No one in, no one out. And I think, this response to this phenomena is very interesting. Once illegal immigration is reversed, immigration practice will stabilize. People will come here on visas again, although they will probably less likely to overstay them. It will literally be fine. This is short attention span brained. And And it says, thinking that people can terrorize innocent tourists, causing massive news stories that percolate across the globe in our hyper-digitized information environment with no detrimental effects as short attention span brained. People do not want to come here anymore. I, the reason I bring this up is because I think he's not wrong. I think one of the reasons why the right always idolizes small town, rural, close-knit, homogenous community living, and you see this through media, a lot of the trad wife stuff, the guys, they're kind of like, every time someone talks about the cost of housing, they're like, get out of cities, get out of cities. It is, and this is kind of this isn't a uniquely American phenomena, but it tends to reach the sublime in the American context. Is that people, are not necessarily as welcoming of newcomers and outsiders as maybe we would like them to be. And small towns kind of typify that in a weird way. And I think people do kind of feel like, as America has become more open, more international, as it has become more just more open to tourism, and more people have started to come here as backpackers and others and all this sort of thing, that people are kind of like, no, I don't think we want that. And also because travel is cheaper now, they've spread kind of out into the country a lot more. So if you're in a medium-sized city, say Kansas City, let's say, then then the chances of you running into a tourist these days are a lot higher than they used to be, because people have grown up watching American movies and American TV shows. I mean, people don't understand American culture overseas is everywhere. I mean, it's such a huge force. And there's franchises of American shows like the American Idol, The Voice, all this sort of thing that and it all it all goes back to us. Like, our one of the most powerful things we export is American culture, music, movies, all this sort of thing. And so that has led people to come here and experience the real thing. And I think for a lot of people, that's fine in New York and Los Angeles and sort of the touristy shopping areas, but they certainly don't want to go down to their local burger joint and find the other non-Americans there. They want to preserve their small, close-knit communities where nobody, keep everyone out, even, it's like no one in, no one out sort of thing. That's, I think, kind of what people want. And if you start to analyze and understand sort of English country life, it ends up being very much the same thing. Well, it used to be. It's not that way anymore, because the demographics of England have changed. But traditionally, certainly for most of the 20th century, English country life was like that. If you wanted to be in with the in crowd, you needed to be born there. Small towns in New England are that way. I mean, really, it's, you're born into it, and you don't leave, sort of thing. And I think people in grasping for community want that more than anything else. And that is, I think that's kind of what people are looking for. And I also think, at a bigger picture, we've had a lot of immigration happen. We've had a lot of new people show up. And traditionally speaking, after we have a big wave of immigration, this country kind of likes to shut the doors and let it settle out, let people assimilate, let people become part of the American story before we're into letting people in again. We've had a fairly long period since 1965 of, very open immigration, and very, lots of new people to adding into the country, especially on work visas, all this type of thing, which leads to comments like, this is a country, an economic zone. People, I think, are really missing that sense of a real country with real values and a real culture that excludes, and this is the important part, excludes others. It is only important if there are people you can exclude for not doing it. And that, and so to get that dynamic going, you have to have a certain amount of exclusivity. You have to have an in-group and an out-group. And so I would say, yeah, I think their observation is correct. Now, I agree, it does lead to a certain amount of economic stagnation. It really does not, make us the cultural superpower that we've been for 50, 60 years. It certainly, makes us isolationist in a world that is ever more globally connected, more than ever before. And that is, I think there are some people that are in favor of that. I think part of the Ingrid globalization isn't just the economics, it's the immigration, it's the, cultural impact. It's how we have interacted with the rest of the world, and how much it's like, there's, every ethnic group and their own food is on every corner. And the sad thing is, it's been that way in America before, when the Italians arrived, when the Germans arrived, when the Polish arrived, all this type of thing. The little town where I'm living in has a little Poland and a little Germany. It's been that way before, but it's been a really long time. That's kind of the dirty secret. It's been a really long time, and things have gotten smoothed out, and now it's just like, oh, little Germany doesn't mean a German enclave. It means the place where you go get beer and sausage. And we're just not that way with a lot of these other cultures and a lot of these other people and places yet. And so that's a big, I think, change people do want to see. And some would argue with good reason. So as we get into the immigration discussion, I want to kind of keep this this dynamic in mind of wanting our country to be a little bit more exclusive. Oh my goodness. Yeah, actually here's kind of, as I move on, something that makes my point. Because we've gained nothing from the quote empire. Our cities and counties, our homeland, has been devastated. Parts of the Rust Belt look more destroyed than Europe did in 1943. Why do we care that something that doesn't benefit us ends? That is exactly the attitude I think a lot of people have, and not just white people. A lot of people have around around all of this. This also is a good thing to mention as we move on. Amy Chua has always argued that history's most successful hyperpowers, like the Romans, the Mongols, and the British, rose to dominance not because they were the most virtuous, but because they strategically tolerated and attracted diverse talent, until they no longer did. Let's move on. Yes, the trade war. Yeah. Let's actually, this is a clip, so let me start this over, and let's watch.
If you take your credit card and you go shopping and you run up a large credit card debt, you're running a trade deficit with all those shops. Now, it would be pretty strange if you then blamed all the shop owners for having sold you all those things. You're ripping me off.
Don't have movie sound. That's gonna be a problem, but that's okay. Here, let's try this.
You're ripping me off. You're ripping me off. I'm running a trade deficit. That is the level of understanding of the President of the United States. The trade deficit does not represent at all trade policies. It represents spending relative to production or earnings. We call that an identity. I teach it in the second day of my course in international monetary economics. Trump never made it to the second day. The US government spends about $2 trillion a year.
He goes on for 7 more minutes, which I'm not going to go on to with right now. But his point is that the U.S. has spent, most of the last 30 years, well, really, if you want to go back far enough, really since the 70s, consuming more than it produces from the rest of the world. And trade deficits, basically, us, buying more than importing more than we export, has economically benefited the rest of the planet in huge outsized way. It's why China is the way it is today. Um, and a lot of that has happened on borrowing. Fortunately, there's been huge demand for U.S. Treasuries. And so we've kind of gotten away with this conceit of being able to consume lavishly on credit, and run huge trade deficits. And now, that's a huge, problem. And the reality is the global economic system that we led and created has been predicated on that simple thing. And so Jeffrey Sachs goes, China wins a trade war with the U.S. because China actually makes things and we don't. Um, and and the replies are very interesting. And and it's and I think with a lot of this, there's always going to be, especially with a country as wealthy as the United States, there's always going to be a bit of a trade deficit. What we make is very high end, very expensive, very important stuff that only makes sense to make here. That is not true for almost the rest of the planet outside of Europe. And so you're always going to end up with these sort of weird trade deficits. I think the thing that people complain about the most is the way in which globalization, free trade, and the reduction of trade barriers has not advantaged people in this country economically beyond inexpensive goods. That and the inexpensive goods don't matter if you can't afford to buy them, right? So you end up in this kind of odd situation where you're talking about the upsides to globalization and lower trade barriers and all that we achieved with the new trading structure that was formed in the 90s with NAFTA and China coming into the World Trade Organization and all this sort of thing, and you end up with this weird situation. People say, well, yeah, that's all fine and well, but everything's made in China now. And that complaint has nothing to do with China. It has everything to do with why American corporations were incentivized, in many cases, to move production overseas. It also sort of goes along with the fact that American industry had been sheltered for so long it was no longer competitive. You saw this with automotive in the 70s. Hadn't had any meaningful competition ever, sort of thing. And what competition there was had by that time consolidated into the big three. And so you ended up in this very kind of odd situation, where when the Japanese cars were introduced, they were, different and smaller and efficient and better for the environment and all this sort of thing. And the American companies were just not at all prepared for that. A similar thing happened in the steel industry. Japan was able to, because they were late to the game, they were able to take advantage of new electric arc furnaces that were cheaper, more efficient, and could produce twice the steel a day of old blast furnaces. And the U.S. took decades to catch up, and the steel industry is still precarious. And unfortunately, a lot of the smaller steel firms and companies, you can see their hulking, rusting remains throughout the Rust Belt, didn't have the capital or access to the capital in order to upgrade their furnaces. And many of the facilities were simply too small for the new electric arc furnaces, and it would have required a huge investment and tons of more electricity. It was easier to close and move on. The reality is, producing things, making things is expensive. It's capital intensive. You have to build a factory. You have to hire people. You have to train the people. You have to spend money on R&D. You have to work with vendors. All this sort of thing. It is a lot to make those things happen. And that sort of thing, when you have sort of new outside competition, makes things very precarious, and it makes things very difficult. And the advantage I think China had was that they were able, because of how they structured their openness, to keep the economic growth very limited in a handful of provinces. They were able to close the rest of their market to a lot of competition, allowing their own native industry to grow up. And they rapidly, learned from the companies that brought their production to China and started creating their own businesses, creating their own factories. This has all been very capital intensive, but for a country that hadn't industrialized, it was absolutely 110% made sense at the time. And the government has poured a lot into that. And now China is a very different country than than it used to be. The downside of that is that a lot of that moved. I look at this and say we have an economic system problem. We could have done the same thing as China. We could have restricted, markets and had targeted, trade barriers on certain things. We chose not to do that because it did not advantage American business. And by American business, I mean American shareholders. The shareholders have enjoyed decades of tremendous growth on the back of cheap Chinese labor. And a lot of the wealth that's sitting in the hands of the few is from those transitions. It did not make it out to other people. The trickle down didn't trickle down. And we're now trying to solve that problem with tariffs trying to force something that really is an economic system issue. If you want the trickle down to start trickling, tax them. And I remarked to someone over the weekend, I said, we didn't need to put up trade barriers, we need to tax the wealthy and corporations. And then create the right social programs, investments in education, all this type of thing that would actually make this country great. Whereas instead, we are reordering the global economic system to try to put us at the center as both consumer and producer, and that I don't think is sustainable. And we're going to get into that more. But it's the fact that Jeffrey Sachs is kind of already siding with China, I thought was interesting. And the way he says our political system is in a state of collapse. And obviously the replies are tawdry, whatever have you. But this one was good. The money didn't get destroyed. It went into someone's pockets. There's always an opposite side of every trade. True. Very true. Couldn't say it better myself. Speaking of disastrous trade policies, I thought this was interesting. Goldman Sachs report comes out and says that Donald Trump's disastrous policies could cost the United States a staggering $90 billion in lost tourism and export revenue. It says here tourism has been cratering as Trump shreds America's global reputation and his border agents continue to detain, terrorize, and deport innocent people. Reports of Europeans being improperly held for weeks have terrified tourists. Last month, tourism plummeted 10% from the prior year, with a 14% dip from the United Kingdom, 27% from Ireland, 28% from Germany, and 34% from Denmark. Canadian flight reservations for the summer season have dropped by an astonishing 70%, directly impacting American businesses and vendors that rely on tourism. Some hotels are reporting an overall 25% drop in bookings from Europeans. It says here at the end that in the worst case scenario, Goldman Sachs estimates a massive 0.3% hit to the GDP, roughly $90 billion. Trump's so-called golden age is turning out to be a new dark age. And this graph from Bloomberg, which I saw, and I was just kind of like, that's quite stark, year over year, in terms of people arriving. It's, the only place that isn't in free fall is Asia. There's an uptick in the Middle East after a big drop. Okay, good for them. But everywhere else, it's just devastating. And this kind of loops back to the story I started with, talking about people wanting a more closed off, culturally homogenous, very tight, society that doesn't have a lot of, outsiders and all this sort of thing. Again, a lot of people, I think, look on this with, some favor. And what was kind of interesting is this is starting to affect the price of oil. Goldman Sachs expects oil prices to decline through the end of this year. And they think it will average between $60 and $59 a barrel through the remainder of 2025 and move slightly lower to $58 and $55 in 2026, which I thought was very interesting. And that definitely, someone remarks like, well, at least oil will be cheaper and therefore gas will be cheaper. Certainly, certainly true. And tourism isn't, obviously we're not a tourism-based economy, so it's not necessarily so terrible. But if you're a business that relies on tourism, or a company, looking at you, Disney, that relies on tourism, this could be quite a change. This is going to really impact your business as people start to, stay away, go elsewhere, all this type of thing. So just something to kind of, add to the overall thread of what's going on and happening here. Let's keep moving. Ah, yes. So, this kind of graph I thought was quite interesting in terms of exports, imports, who with and where from. And it kind of shows that they have gotten kind of more diverse in who they're working with. So, for example, exports to the U.S. have remained relatively high, less so, of course, with the EU. Expansion with India. Things with Vietnam have gotten quite cozy. Things with Thailand have diverged. They're exporting more to Thailand than importing. Singapore is still quite distant. UK is still quite distant. And the thread is interesting because it starts out by saying China has spent 7 years making, quote, bad economic choices to prepare itself for decoupling as anticipated since 2018. It has diversified trade partners, deflated stock and real estate bubble, punished big tech, and encouraged new startups, drove industrial policy in new emerging sectors. Due to the 2022 tech war, it accelerated de-risking from U.S. supply chain, especially choke points. And then it goes down to this breakdown of all this sort of thing. It has significantly increased imports from Asian, South American, and African countries for products and raw material due to the unreliability of U.S. and its allies. All while U.S. big tech remain heavily dependent on sales in China, even if the direct export data doesn't show it because chips and equipment are imported elsewhere. Aside from Lenovo, China Inc. really doesn't depend on U.S. sales due to existing fears in U.S. about Chinese spying. And it goes into why China is so important for big tech. And it's hard to emphasize how disastrous this is. How do small businesses operate if they cannot get the goods that they need? And it shows that, trade between the U.S. and China due to the 245% tariff is coming to a halt. And imports down, exports down, imports from China down, exports to China down, all of it down. And it's and people are trying to say, oh no, we're just going to switch to new suppliers, and the reality is that the trade between the world's two largest economies is basically grinding to a halt. China is very prepared for this. We are not. And again, there were other ways to achieve this goal. One of the great things the Biden administration did was create 250,000 new manufacturing jobs because they put in an industrial policy for the first time in 40 years. If Trump had really kept that train going, we would already be seeing a resurgence in manufacturing jobs. I think one of the problems with the Democratic Party, I was having this conversation over the weekend, is because they didn't clear out a lot of the red tape for environmental reviews and all this type of thing. Most of the success of the Biden administration is going to happen sometime later this year into 2026. And Trump will get credit for it, sort of thing. And he'll certainly be there to take credit for something that he had almost nothing doing. But I think Trump term 1 was a big wake-up call for China. Certainly what the Biden administration did was another wake-up call, which gets into this whole 2022 tech war thing. The Biden administration really put the screws to China about tech and everything. And so China has already been looking to do this. So China's in kind of a pole position of being able to decouple. I don't quite buy that they've deflated their stock and real estate bubble. I know that they are definitely not allowing companies to consolidate, and they're trying to keep the economy dynamic, sort of thing. But they still have a stock and real estate bubble problem and a debt problem, and we don't know how bad it is because we can't trust those numbers. So that's a very interesting dynamic sort of thing. But I agree, China's in a great position, and with it opening up new markets for itself, it's put itself in a wonderful place. And we just can't compete because we've not created the proper conditions for it. We haven't. And that's okay, but that's the reality of the situation. But the fact that China's been making this move for a while also goes to show what we can always say. China's a 5,000-year-old civilization. They think in decades and centuries. We think in 4-year chunks. We're not even having the same conversation. This article in Foreign Affairs about the global trading system is very interesting. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's foreign affairs. It's long. But I do want to dive into the first couple paragraphs. Um, and it kind of puts a cap on this whole situation. Um, and it says here, whatever happens in the near term, this much is clear. Trump's policies reflect a transformation of the global trading capital regime that has already started. One way or another, a dramatic change of some kind was necessary to address imbalances in the global economy that have been decades in the making. Current trade tensions are the result of a disconnect between the needs of individual economies and the needs of the global system. Although the global system benefits from rising wages, which push up demand for producers everywhere, tensions arise when individual countries can grow more quickly by boosting their manufacturing sectors at the expense of wage growth. For example, by directly and indirectly suppressing growth in household income relative to growth in worker productivity. The result is a global trading system in which, to their collective detriment, countries compete by keeping wages down. The tariff regime Trump announced earlier this month is unlikely to solve this problem. To be effective, American trade policy must either reverse the savings imbalance in the rest of the world, or it must limit Washington's role in accommodating it. Bilateral tariffs do neither. But because something must replace the current system, policymakers would be wise to start crafting a sensible alternative. The best outcome would be a new global trade agreement amongst economies that commit to managing their domestic economic imbalances rather than externalizing them in the form of trade surpluses. The result would be a customs union, like the one proposed by the economist John Maynard Keynes at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. Parties to this agreement would be required to roughly balance their exports and imports while restricting trade surpluses from countries outside the trade agreement. Such a union could gradually expand to the entire world, leading both to higher global wages and better economic growth. Keynes' plan failed to carry the day at Bretton Woods largely because the United States, the leading surplus economy at the time, opposed it. Today, however, there's a chance to revive and adopt his proposal. And it goes through the whole thing. It's foreign affairs, so we're not going to read the whole thing. Goes through how that all might work. And I bring this up because Michael Pettis is amazing. He actually identifies what the actual problem is. And that is countries competing by keeping wages down, keeping cost of labor cheap, which makes for individual workers and average people a really crappy situation. It leads to the where do all the good jobs go? It leads to that phenomena. If you want to go check this out, it's on Foreign Affairs. The global trading system was already broken. Tariffs don't solve these problems, but I think some sort of customs union, something like that, would certainly balancing out the surplus, balancing out trade deficits, which is kind of what the Trump administration wants to do, but they're not really doing it. Would definitely, I think, help to solve the problems that they've identified that I think are real problems. And it would definitely, help to start keeping things more even and more fair for all parties involved, so you don't end up with other countries taking the hit for too much savings or too much consumption, and keep things more even while also keeping wages rising for everybody. It would keep the money moving, and that's the problem. Money hasn't moved, a lot of money hasn't moved in a long time, and money's only useful when it's moving. Before we move on to a whole other subject, because we're going to get immigration here, I found this on the Hill, and I thought it was interesting. This is kind of how far out, like we talk about China a lot and Asia, but people have kind of forgotten with the U.S. aid cuts, this has adversely impacted Africa especially. And what I think is interesting is we now have an Africa First response at the African Union. It says here, in recent months, the name Burtukan Temesgen has become synonymous with years of human rights abuses in Ethiopia. That country has largely become a failed state under the rule of its strongman Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, despite, or maybe in part of, because of generous aid from the U.S. and the West. In 2019, Burtukan had overcome a rough childhood in Africa's second most populous nation to become a thriving student at Dembi Doolo University. One day, while walking across the campus, she was kidnapped by gunmen and brought to a remote corner of the Ethiopian jungle, where she says she was raped and forced to give birth to a child. 6 years later, Berta Khan emerged to tell her story through interviews and a documentary captivating the nation. However, in a subsequent interview, she recanted her story, a move many believe she was coerced. Her saga also called attention to the dozens of similar kidnappings and missing students over the last 6 years. The lack of accountability for the lethal campaign of ethnic cleansing against her ethnic Amhara people by the Abiy regime continues, even as the Ethiopian ruler basks in the Nobel Peace Prize he was awarded by the West in 2019. The U.S., under both Democratic and Republican administrations, has largely ignored civil war, endemic corruption, and economic decline under Abiy's rule. For years, he continued to offer carrots of humanitarian and developmental aid, including a recent major bailout through the International Monetary Fund, while not deploying the stick of consequences for the regime's crimes against humanity. Although much remains up in the air, President Trump's return sent a clear signal that this era is over. It is rapidly being replaced with an America First policy that centers economic self-interest of both the U.S. and its potential trading partners while downplaying democratic concerns. The contours of this dramatic change became clear in the early days of Trump's second term, as the returning president and his cost-cutting team, led by billionaire Elon Musk, all but shut down the U.S. Agency for International Development and mostly cut off the spigot of foreign aid that across Africa has paid for programs like disease eradication and free school lunches. The U.S. government spent a whopping $6.5 billion on aid to sub-Saharan Africa last year. The apparent end of large-scale U.S. foreign aid is a crisis that also creates an opportunity. Trump's America First policies are now reality for the next 4 years, if not longer. It creates an opening for forward-thinking countries, including Ethiopia, to forge their own Africa First policies that will rebuild the continent through enhanced trade and human rights reforms, not handouts from the West. Solomon Youssef Kitenge of African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, argued forcefully for an Africa First policy in a recent op-ed, noting that too often governments in the region use foreign aid from the U.S. or elsewhere to prop up flagging government services rather than on permanent economic development. An Africa First approach should emphasize domestic resource mobilization, strengthening transportation systems and other social services, as well as the advancement of institutions and human capital, Kitenge wrote. This shift would strengthen Africa's economic independence while reducing reliance on foreign aid. The shock of the American aid cutoff should force African leaders to focus on the untapped economic potential of the continent, which is home to a massive consumer market and potential workforce. This would mean expanding the scope and power of the current African Continental Free Trade Area, reining in the current black market that causes governments to lose billions of dollars in potential annual tax revenue, and a serious effort to eliminate endemic corruption. And I thought it goes on to some more detail we're not going to get into, but I thought it was interesting that, in a weird way, cutting off the spigot may be the best thing to happen to Africa. Perhaps it will force African governments to get together, to put their heads together, and start to forge real solutions. And that's not a bad thing. It's the reordering of this global trading system is going to have a lot of consequences for a long time. This is just one. This is just part of the conversation. But I found it interesting and I wanted to mention it because I think the sort of Africa First response and wanting to actually get serious about economic development is going to be very important. And in light of China's moves in Africa, China's going to be right there to sell them every ship, every port, everything. And I think it could, matching up China's manufacturing with African raw resources, China's ability to kind of make it all happen, keep it moving. That's an economic powerhouse right there. And I think that could be, I think it'll be interesting to see kind of how, how the relationships between Africa and China match up in the near future, especially as the West sort of walks away from a lot of these problems. Especially in light of, U.S. aid going away. So, let's shift around to immigration. Oh, we don't need this tab. We actually talked about this last week, I think. That's okay. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit. Well, we're not going to talk entirely about immigration right now because we have other. Do we have other immigration things? Oh yeah, here's one. I usually have these in better order, but here we are. Let's start here. So, last night, the Supreme Court temporarily blocked Trump from deporting more Venezuelan migrants. says here, in an unusual late-night order, the Supreme Court temporarily barred the Trump administration from deporting Venezuelan migrants being held in Texas using an 18th century law called the Alien Enemies Act. The order came in response to an emergency petition filed by the ACLU, with Justices Thomas and Alito dissenting. John Yang speaks with Amy Howe of SCOTUS blog for more. And as a whole thing. But we're only going to read this bit right here. And so lawyers from the ACLU had come to the Supreme Court filing an emergency appeal asking the justice to block the removal of Venezuelan migrants from that facility to El Salvador. And the Supreme Court at 1 a.m. on a Saturday morning issued an order that said until further notice from this court, the federal government can't remove anyone from this district. The Supreme Court hasn't said anything about the substance of the president's order, which he issued back in March, relying on this Alien Enemies Act, the 1798 law that gives the president power to order the removal of enemy aliens without, to have them removed relatively quickly. The order has only been, the law has only been invoked 3 times in U.S. history during the War of 1812, during World War I, and during World War II. And some lawyers and legal scholars say that the president can't rely on this law at all to remove anyone right now, but the Supreme Court isn't weighing in on that right now, at least. And I had seen a news wrap-up this morning of someone who joked they should write a thesis about everything that happened this weekend, politically, and this was kind of a marquee thing. This got no press. None. Absolutely nothing. And I just thought it was really interesting, that this has happened, and the tension over Abrego Garcia and is the MS-13 to be reserved to El Salvador has really kind of come to a fever pitch, and the Supreme Court has said, no, you can't, you can't do that, and, is the Trump administration going to defy the order? It sets up a whole, this, depending on what the Trump administration does, this could be the news story of the week. So, it was worth mentioning now, certainly. And worth talking about because it didn't get as much press this morning, as it really should have. Although, to be fair, today's been dominated by the fact that Pope Francis has died. I meant to lead the show with that, and I totally forgot. But yes, Pope Francis died today, Monday, April 21st. And so that has kind of knocked some stuff out of the news cycle today. But I think, this can be a story of the week. So, worth keeping an eye on. Speaking of people being detained sort of unnecessarily, immigration officials in Tucson arrested the 19-year-old man from Albuquerque on April 8th, saying he'd entered the country illegally before a judge dismissed his case on April 17th. It says here, U.S. citizen in Arizona detained by immigration officials for 10 days. It says here that 19-year-old Jose Hermosillo, who's visiting from Tucson from Albuquerque, says he was lost and walking near the Border Patrol headquarters when an agent arrested him for illegally entering the country. Hermosillo was not carrying identification. Court documents say a Border Patrol agent arrested Hermosillo at or near Nogales, Arizona, without proper immigration documents, and that Hermosillo admitted to illegally entering the U.S. Hermosillo and his girlfriend, who have a 9-month-old child together, live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and are visiting family in Tucson. He said he's never been to Nogales. His girlfriend's aunt, Grace Leyva, says she and her family made numerous calls looking for him before they found out he was being detained in the Florence Correctional Center, which Immigration and Customs Enforcement uses to detain people. Another family member drove to the detention center about 70 miles northwest of Tucson, but said officials wouldn't provide any information or release him. ICE did not respond to a request for comment about the wrongful detention. The family later provided officials with his birth certificate and social security card. He did say he was a U.S. citizen, but they didn't believe him, Leyva said. I think they would have kept him, but I think they would have, even if they would have not have got that information yesterday in the court and gave that to ICE and the Border Patrol, he probably would have been deported already to Mexico. A magistrate judge in Tucson dismissed his case on Thursday, and the family says he was released much later that night. There have been other recent cases of U.S. citizens being wrongly detained by immigration officials, including a man wrongly held in Florida after being pulled over during his commute to work. So I suppose we all need to make sure we keep our identification honest these days, because they're just rounding people up. But this is not great. I joke about it. This is not great. The fact it's like well, he looks like an illegal sort of thing, and so therefore deserves to be detained is pretty terrible. It's not a good thing, and the fact that you as a citizen cannot freely walk about your country without some papers proving you're supposed to be there because your name is Jose Hermosillo, is not an America I think any of us would recognize. So that one gives me pause on where are we at as a country. Very concerning. So, I want to circle back to a story that we didn't, I think, talk about enough at the time, and that is the new Republican budget. So, as I'm sure we all remember, Chuck Schumer got in buku biggie trouble for pushing through a continuing resolution to keep the government open while a budget could be passed. Earlier this month, a couple weeks ago, the House passed a budget that is different in major ways from the version it passed in February. It would allow Republicans to cut taxes by more, trim spending by less, and increase the federal debt by far more. The budget itself is sparse on policy details, but Congress still needs to write specific legislation that follows its basic instructions if it wants to achieve President Trump's goal of reshaping taxes and spending through, quote, one big beautiful bill. Here's what's in the budget now. It differs from the previous version. So, we have more spending. Both budgets would extend parts of the 2017 Trump tax cuts, but the new version would allow lawmakers to make the cuts lasting, while the earlier version would require them to expire again in 10 years. That means that while their costs are the same initially, the new version could increase federal deficits and debts by much more after 2034. To make lasting cuts possible, the new budget uses an unconventional accounting maneuver known as the current policy baseline, which assumes the 2017 tax cuts don't expire after this year, even though the law that created them says they will. It's still unclear whether the move complies with the Senate's special rules for budget legislation, but lawmakers decided to use the baseline without consulting the Senate rules expert in advance. So, they're allowed to cut more taxes. There are, much fewer spending cuts required. There are spending increases are allowed a great deal more. And it says here, there's one major sign that lawmakers expect to increase the deficit more than this version. It would raise the debt ceiling by a larger amount than the February version. The debt ceiling limits how much money the federal government is allowed to borrow. Republicans want to pass a major package of policy changes using a special reconciliation process that could pass without any Democratic votes in the Senate. The budget lays out the required targets for that process, sort of thing. And for those that are, complaining about, the cuts and, all this type of thing, and people, talking about healthcare, they are planning some cuts to Medicaid. It says here, the old version of the budget required extensive spending cuts up to $2 trillion, with a large share assigned to the House committee that oversees the Medicaid program. The new budget requires far less on paper, though congressional leaders say they still intend to pass substantial spending cuts as part of their final legislation. House conservatives who are concerned about the federal debt objected to this vagueness and declined to vote for the resolution until Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Majority Leader John Thune made public assurances that despite the budget's vague targets, the process will cut federal spending by at least $1.5 trillion over a decade. But the new version makes it much harder to know how big the cuts will be or what programs will be cut to hit that target. Some Republican senators have expressed concern about the effects of big Medicaid cuts on their states, and more flexible targets could make it easier to avoid major cuts without upending the entire bill. So, this is going to be continuing on for a while, but when I was talking about this with someone, I had mentioned that no, they are planning cuts to Medicaid, which is a block grant programs to states, and this sort of thing. And I realized that maybe we didn't talk about where we are in the budget process enough, and so I wanted to kind of bring everybody up to speed on understanding we have a framework for a new budget that kind of sets some rules on tax cuts, spending, what's getting cut, all this type of thing. Very similar to what, what we have gone on before. We have tax cuts and more spending, which in the new version, as written, would add nearly $7 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years, including interest and more in years afterwards. That high number reflects the uncertainty of the spending cuts. Lawmakers will choose to cut spending by more than $4 billion over the decade, but we don't yet know by how much. And so you basically have very modest spending decreases, a lot more debt, and the permanent 2017 tax cut regime is kind of where things are going. I think a lot of, if they keep to the $4 billion in cost savings, then I don't think you're going to see a whole lot out of Medicaid. If they want to do more, then yeah, it's going to be a lot out of probably Medicaid. So I just wanted to kind of level set with that, let everybody know where we're in the process. It actually takes 12 pieces of legislation to write the whole federal budget, so they're still in that process. It's going to be a while before we see more, but I wanted to kind of find out where we were in the process and what the current zeitgeist about it was, so we could talk intelligently about it. Now, this juicy story, oh boy. So, Letitia James was the person who was prosecuting Trump in New York, and it appears that she has an issue with some loan paperwork and real estate of her own, interestingly enough. It says here, the Trump administration has begun to scrutinize the real estate transactions of New York's Attorney General Letitia James in what could be the opening move of President Trump's first investigation into one of his foremost adversaries. The head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency sent a criminal referral letter to the Department of Justice this week, saying that Ms. James appeared to have falsified records related to properties she owns in Virginia and New York in order to receive favorable loan terms. The letter was dated April 14th, one day after Mr. Trump posted a story involving the claims against Ms. James on Truth Social and called her a crook. It's unclear whether the allegations against Ms. James, which have been touted online for weeks by Mr. Trump's allies, are substantive enough to merit criminal charges. Ms. James has been one of Trump's primary opponents since her office filed a lawsuit against him in 2022, accusing him of overvaluing his assets by billions in order to receive favorable loan terms. The president has promised retribution against his political enemies. During the first several months of his second term, Mr. Trump mostly avoided the use of the justice system to target his enemies. But last week he signed presidential memos singling out officials who opposed him during his first term and directing his agencies to scrutinize their actions. And the U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, Alina Habba, said she was opening an investigation into the state's governor. The letter concerning Ms. James, who, along with other state attorneys general, has sued Mr. Trump's administration a dozen times since January, goes still further in the specificity of its allegations. It cites documents concerning two properties, a house in Norfolk, Virginia that she bought with a niece in 2023, and a Brooklyn house she's owned for 24 years. And they go into what the spokesperson said. And apparently it goes into the fact that when purchasing the Virginia residence, Miss James signed notarized paperwork attesting she would use it as a principal residence. Roger J. Stone, Jr., Mr. Trump's longest-serving political advisor, has been one of the several right-wing critics to point out that she did not live in Virginia and accused her in heated language of committing mortgage fraud. On Tuesday, Mr. Stone directed a social media post at Miss James warning, "Look for the FBI on your doorstep one morning soon." Virginia real estate lawyers said the paperwork might be an issue if Miss James misrepresented the truth to the lender, but on a separate loan application form provided by the Attorney General's office, Miss James indicated that she did not intend to occupy the property as a primary residence. Her mortgage agreement did not require her to do so. And so it was, I wanted to bring this up only because this will be a story du jour this week from the right, and in the whole, there was lawfare against Trump, and they were trying to destroy our God, and all this sort of thing. You end up with this sort of situation and this sort of scrutiny. Now, if she did something wrong, she did something wrong, and that should be taken care of. But I do feel like this is Trump's retribution revenge tour. We knew he was going to do this, and anyone that did anything sort of askew of the law is going to come under scrutiny, and people will be certain to go after that. Speaking of that, though, I don't often play videos on the Newshour, but I wanted to because it appears that there might be some cracks in Trumpland. And I found this clip from Hassan Piker commenting on Joe Rogan, and I thought it was interesting. So let's watch.
Legitimate argument about the right to due process if you get processed and shipped out of the country and put in a prison in El Salvador. Was it Benjamin Franklin's quote about innocent, and that it's better to allow 10 guilty people to go free than one innocent person arrested? You know, I'm on that side of things.
Yeah.
I think due process exists for a reason, and the reason is...
I told you, this is how it begins. There's only so much insanity that even the ape man and his supporters are going to take. This is how the process begins. The process of discontent begins amongst the ranks, amongst those in the margins who go, maybe this wasn't the best decision. I still like Trump. I think he can restore order here and right this wrong.
We have to make sure that these people are actually guilty, otherwise we become monsters. You can't, like, what is that? When you fight monsters, be careful that you don't become one.
Become one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very important. But also also have to deal with the fact that the current administration is dealing with the past administration allowing known...
He's in the bargaining phase. I'm telling you, what you're watching is the bargaining phase of the process. He's like, oh, well,
Yeah.
you know, all the previous lies that Trump told me that caused me to vote for him, I have to maintain are real and true, right? Otherwise, I have to recognize.
No, I mean, I think it's... So I think this is a little bit sort of interesting in so much as the way, and we're not going to watch, it's 24 minutes, so we're not going to watch the whole thing, but it's kind of interesting that even, like, already, it hasn't even finished yet. We're not even 3 months into this administration, we're just 3 months into this administration, and there's already kind of the seams cracking. The moderate sort of apolitical bro that got involved, which is who's Joe Rogan's audience is, is kind of all like, well, that doesn't look great. I don't think that's too good. Maybe we shouldn't be doing that sort of thing. It's kind of interesting to where the cracks are already starting to form on some of the more egregious parts of the administration, which tells me, will they ever get to mass deportations? Will they ever get rid of people? Will any of the stuff we're talking about now matter in 6 months? And I would argue, probably not. I think the minute Trump feels like he's starting to lose people on something, he'll move on quickly. And that goes for everything, especially on something like immigration. Less so the trade war, but on immigration. Yeah, I mean, I think when people start to lose it, they're going to lose it. And then he'll just move on quickly. That's how it always goes with him. The minute it becomes unpopular, off he goes. And I thought that was interesting. Speaking of Letitia James and sort of Trump's revenge tour, we also have President Trump ordered Attorney General Pam Bondi and other top officials on Thursday to investigate 2 of his former first-term officials who publicly refuted his baseless claims that the 2020 election was fraudulent and criticized his chaotic administration from within. Chris Krebs, who directed Trump's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and Miles Taylor, a former senior Department of Homeland Security official, are the latest targets in Trump's widening retribution campaign against his perceived political enemies. Trump fired Krebs in November 2020, and the former CISA head defended the integrity of the 2020 election, while Taylor anonymously wrote a New York Times op-ed and later a book detailing the chaos inside the Trump White House. In 2 executive orders, Trump stripped Krebs, Taylor, and people or companies associated with them of their security clearances as well. In his order against Krebs, Trump said he was targeting the former public servant for saying the 2020 election was not rigged. Quote, abusive conduct of this sort both violates the First Amendment and erodes trust in government, thus undermining the strength of our democracy itself, Trump's order reads. Krebs was a key witness during Congress's investigation into the January 6th assault on the Capitol. In his testimony before a January 6th Select Committee, Krebs said Republican officials, quote, lied to the American people about the security of the 2020 election. And it goes into Liz Cheney and, all this sort of thing. And this is another chapter in his revenge tour. And and the thing is, someone like Letitia James will command a headline. This won't, which is why it's worth bringing up. There's lots of other people like, Chris Krebs that are going to have a very difficult time defending this, especially given how Trump is trying to punish law firms for defending people against the Trump administration. So, if you're Chris Krebs, who do you call? Or are you just going to allow yourself to be sent up the river? This is where this all starts to tie together. This whole, ignoring court orders, trying to sanction law firms, trying to, revenge and attack people. There is not necessarily a holistic logic to it, but it all kind of adds together in, very simply, because Trump is a strong man. You go against Trump, you lose. You don't follow what Trump says, you lose. You criticize Trump, you lose. You speak out against Trump, you lose. The point is, Trump wins, you lose. Which is a classic narcissist sort of thing. But it's like, Trump wins, you lose. And that's honestly a lot of the point of this, is Trump wins, you lose. And he's going to use the whole system to come down on your head to make sure he comes out on top and you don't. And when you empower people like this is the type of thing you end up with. By the way, I love democracydocket.com. If you want to keep up on especially the legal side of the Trump administration, this website is absolutely amazing and you should definitely keep an eye on them. So, again, not going to read the whole story here, but the fact that he's going after anybody who didn't go along with his 2020 election lies is just another part of his own revenge and retribution tour. So this thread, this kind of started, with the conversation I was having last night. And apropos, as Pope Francis has died today, the new sort of trendy thing of young people converting to Catholicism en masse, driven by pandemic, internet, and lax alternatives. Protestants, eat your heart out. But, it's interesting where, there's kind of this big upsurge and uptick in religion. I will not be upsurging and upticking to religion, but this person says, obviously I'm an extremely pro-religion person. It's true there is social momentum moving towards religion, Christianity in general, and then I see this as positive. A nagging feeling I've always had, but have mostly kept to myself until recently, is that if this is a retreat, it won't work. The modern condition is just that, a condition. It's a set of circumstances that are largely new. Unfortunately, that means they won't be solved by being ignored. The engagement with most modern and postmodern problems online is frankly often and not always pretty bad. I don't like to score on my own team, so I don't have to make it a habit of pointing this out, but there's very few people actually working at solving these problems, the postmodern condition, and seeing them as legitimate problems rather than simply hand-waving them away as some kind of mass deception. One example of the issue of subjectivity and relativism you often see people dismiss this out of hand by saying, well, there is one truth, the truth. There's one thing that is true. Reality exists, so we can start from there, scrap all the relativism and subjectivity nonsense, and find the truth. But this doesn't solve the problem as it presents itself in postmodernity at all. Almost no one, especially no one involved in the articulation of the modern and postmodern conditions, thought that there was no objective reality in this sense. Everyone recognized that if there's a rock in your front yard, that's real. Whatever you think in your head isn't going to change that. The actual angle, which normal people have now absorbed by osmosis, even if they can't articulate it, is that between you and reality are things that impart subjectivity inherently, things you cannot actually transcend as an individual. One of the most defensible and concrete examples is language. In French, they have a word for a river that flows into a fresh body of water, so I'm told, and another word for a river that flows into an ocean. I don't have these words, so this distinction doesn't always fundamentally color my perception of rivers, and my perception of reality. That's true. That just actually is the case. If you're plucking at the threads of the tapestry of the modern condition, and why life is the way it is now, that being one thread in a tapestry of 100 to 1,000 things, just dismissing them out of hand doesn't make it go away. A large portion of this turn towards religion as a popular movement has been characterized by this sort of out-of-hand dismissal of the things that make modern life the way it is, things that are real. It also has been characterized by a backwards orientation, as though the answer is just pretending it's a previous time period and that these conditions don't exist. Catholicism itself is an interesting example, as Vatican I can be partially read as addressing modernism, same time period, and Vatican II can be read as addressing postmodernism, also same time period. The reality is that the solution to the problems of modern life will be engaging with those issues as real, not as mirages or hallucinations carefully crafted by a few sick or misguided academics, and that any solution will involve moving forward, beyond it, through it, and not just retreating from it. And I think it's, I think the current rise, and this is kind of the story about the rise in religion, I think the rise in religion, I think partly is a retreat and looking for solutions to an ever more complicated world. We've seen this in history before. You know what drove church attendance? The Depression. You know what also drove church attendance in the 50s? Nuclear war, or the potential of it. When things get bad out there in the world, people go inside. You know, they start looking for things that they can rely on. I think also a big part of Catholicism, especially Catholicism, because it's a big institution, is slotting into a community. In a world where community outside of religious stuff is hard to find, and it's hard to find, you know, a religion, especially a global tradition like that, really slots people in to a ready-made community around shared values, around shared ideas, and that has something that seems so lacking in the postmodern period: identity, weight, tradition, existing for a length of time. You know, it's very different to be a part of something that's 2,000 years long, that has a, you know, a glorious and amazing, if sometimes ignominious history. That I think also is part of the reason why it appeals. But I think also in a time of economic upheaval, in a time of social upheaval, in a time of lacking community, all this type of thing, religion offers all of that in a kind of ready-made plug into it and you're there sort of thing. So I think it is a retreat. I don't necessarily know that people want to confront the problems of postmodernity. And I think religion is a way to not have to explore those. To not have to deal with the problems that we have and that we've created. And I think that's a very big, important part of the resurgence in religion. And obviously, you know, people who've already been involved in church and all this type of thing, is, you know, I think is, you know, part of, for people who are already dialed into it, they see it as a good thing, and people are finally coming back, and, you know, Christ is king. In fact, I think that was a reply down here, wasn't it? Yeah, there it is. You know, all this sort of thing. That, you know, in after these decades of leaving religion behind and exploring, you know, atheism and all these other things, you know, it's now sort of a return, sort of like the meme, to a different, simpler time. And let's face it, existence is complicated. Being human is complicated. And religion offers easy answers, you know, relatively easy answers, to the complicated questions of life. And I think, you know, given all that's happened, especially in the last few years, it's very easy to look for the easy answer. And religion has always been there, offering the easy answer, you know, and an easy way to feel like you know what's going on in a world that's ever more complicated. I think socially and politically, if this is sticky and lasts long term, this will lead to a much more conservative country. And those of us who are liberal are probably going to really struggle with how conservative this country could become if this becomes sticky. And I say that as someone who grew up evangelical in the early 2000s, when being evangelical was kind of popular and all this type of thing, you know. And a lot of people started going to church then because of, you know, terrorism and 9/11 and all this sort of thing. I mean, it's, you know, so I've kind of seen this before. And we, you know, the result of that later was Barack Obama and sort of a new liberalism. But, I mean, the Bush years are really tough, you know, for that, especially coming out of the 90s. So it, I'll be interested to see how long this lasts. Is it trendy? Is it sticky? We'll find out. In our final story, and I warned you we were going to go long tonight. In our final story, there isn't much to this, but I thought it was very interesting. This federal whistleblower, has, Daniel Baroulis, has informed Congress that Doge has, apparently pulled off a covert cyber op inside a federal agency. They came into, where did they come into? The National Labor Relations Board, with clearances. They demanded root access, over the servers, came in, it says here, notably within minutes of Doge personnel creating user accounts in NLRB systems on multiple occasions, someone or something within Russia attempted to log in using all the valid credentials. This, combined with verifiable data being systematically exfiltrated to unknown servers within the continental United States and perhaps abroad, merits investigation. Included in Exhibit B are select screenshots of technical data for your review. As you are certainly aware, the practical, legal, and national security implications of such an intrusion are vast. At bare minimum, the conduct here violates the Federal Information Security Modernization Act and guidelines set forth by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and National Institute of Standards and Technology. Moreover, this breach at the very least exposes Privacy Act protected information. Furthermore, on April 7th, while my client and my team were preparing for this disclosure, someone physically taped a threatening note to Mr. Baroulis' home door with photographs taken via drone of him walking in his neighborhood. The threatening note made clear reference to this very disclosure he was preparing for you as the proper oversight authority. While we do not specifically know who did this, we can only speculate that it involves someone with the ability to access NLRB systems. This meat space action, where a threat was physically delivered to my client's home, is absolutely disturbing in its manner and the implications suggested therein. Accordingly, and we've all been and will continue to be coordinating with appropriate law enforcement agencies. And they disabled the logs. They ordered security controls bypassed and disabled tools like network watches so the networks wouldn't be tagged. And then 10 gigabytes spiked outbound traffic. It actually cost them money because Microsoft charged them for all of that extra money. It says that the Russian attacks are within 15 minutes of the Doge accounts being created. And basically two options. Either one, Russia has an in to everything Doge does, or two, Doge is actively working with Russia. MFA was disabled, all this sort of thing. It was, again, this is not a big story. No one's going to pay that close attention to it. Not even close. But this was, yeah. This was quite, a quite interesting thing. We'll probably never find out if this is real or not, but I found it quite, of all the data breaches with Doge, I thought it was interesting that this one had a direct connection to a foreign power. Now, when it comes to government information, I don't care who it is, they're not supposed to see it, and they shouldn't be seeing it. Again, this story will get almost no play, but I thought it was an interesting kind of pile on that Doge is either compromised or has been hacked, or maybe both. So, anyway, we've gone way over time, which I planned to do because there were so many stories. So, thank you all for watching. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal Podcast. Please find me online at Cameron Cowan on Instagram and Twitter, Cameron L. Cowan on Facebook, and at Cameron Journal on Blue Sky and TikTok. And have a great week, everyone. The interview this week is with Jamar Mercury. We're talking about politics, the Trump administration, and his view of things as a Black Republican voter. So that's very exciting. And how he does his political activism and everything, and his wonderful experiences. That's with Dr. Jamar Montgomery. So please check out that interview. We're back down to one interview a week. We were doing 2 or 3 at one point because I had produced a bunch of content. We're back down to 1 a week, which is nice. So make sure to check out the interview with Dr. Jamar Montgomery. I have a lot of great episodes for you coming up, including one with a relationship expert where we go very deep into me and my relationship issues. So that's very exciting. There's great interesting content coming up for you on the Cameron Journal this week. So make sure to check out CameronJournal.com. Please sign up for the newsletter. If you haven't signed up for Cameron Journal Plus, please do so. We've had new subscribers this week, new people who are supporting the Cameron Journal. So if you want to join them, get exclusive content, get the newsletter every Saturday, all this type of thing, please go and sign up. The newsletter is free, but if you want to subscribe and help support the Cameron Journal and support me in doing this important work, I would appreciate it so much. Thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Have a great night, and thank you for watching the Cameron Journal News Hour. See you next week. Bye-bye.